Welcome back, Focus Learners. Have you ever stopped and wondered why Eastern spirituality often feels like this deep quest for inner peace, while Western religion plays out more like a dramatic, high-stakes relationship with a higher power? Well, today we are diving into an explainer of Joseph Campbell's groundbreaking work in his volume, The Masks of God, Occidental Mythology. Campbell offers us this sweeping, deeply fascinating look at how humanity's view of the divine literally split into two completely diverging paths. And it's a split that didn't just stay in the past. It shaped the cultures, the philosophies, and the very psychological frameworks that you and I are still living with today. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. This is the fundamental philosophical divide that splits the world's mythological traditions right down the middle. Think about it. When we try to grasp the ultimate mystery of the universe, what do? Do we look inward to find a transcendent energy that we are already intrinsically a part of, or do we look up, trying to relate to a distinct, supreme creator who is entirely separate from us? This single, massive question is literally the engine driving millennia of human history, art, and belief.
Campbell points out a really fascinating geographical dividing line for this monumental split, the tableland of Iran. Look to the east, towards India and the Far East, and we find the Oriental myth. Over there, the divine is experienced as a transcendent energy. It's this ultimate ground of being that goes way beyond human thought, imagery, or definition. It's a completely unnameable mystery. But if you look westward, to Europe and the Levant, you find the Occidental myth. In this Western tradition, that same ground of being is typically personified as a personal creator. God is the creator, man is the creature, and crucially, the two are absolutely not the same thing.
To really grasp the Eastern perspective, you just need three little words: thou art that. In the East, the supreme aim of myth isn't about worshiping a literal deity from afar, not at all. Instead, the prayers, the chants, the images, and the gods, they are used as what Campbell beautifully calls fairies. They're vehicles. Their whole purpose is to catalyze an experience, transporting you to a profound, unbreakable realization of your own identity with the universe. You use the myth to realize that the divine mystery is actually your own true self. And then, well, you leave the fairy behind.
Now, contrast that profound Eastern unity with the Western perspective. We see this stark humility perfectly captured in the book of Job. In the West, God and man stand facing each other as entirely distinct entities. If a person turns inward here, they don't find the divine. They just find their own separate creaturely soul. Because of this, Occidental mythology requires something completely different from the individual. It's not about realizing you are the universe. It's about figuring out how to relate your tiny, creaturely self to this awe-inspiring, overarching creator. You aren't merging with the divine, you're talking to it, you're obeying it, and yeah, sometimes you're even arguing with it.
So we're looking at these two entirely contrasting worldviews. But it really begs the question, where did this massive spiritual split actually begin? To figure out how the East and West diverged so sharply, Campbell argues that we have to travel back, way back, far beyond the written texts of the Bible or the Vedas. We have to dig into the dirt of our shared ancient history to uncover the deep-rooted origins where both of these diverging paths originally started.
And it turns out that defining epical mutation for human mythology wasn't some new philosophical idea. It was a technology. Right around 7500 BC in the Near East, humans developed the arts of agriculture and stock breeding. We transformed from roaming bands of hunters into settled tillers of the earth. And you know, this massive leap in human evolution changed absolutely everything. It birthed self-sustaining villages, which eventually grew into the high civilization of Sumer by about 3500 BC, giving us writing, mathematics, and monumental architecture. By 2500 BC, this entirely new, deeply rooted agricultural civilization and its corresponding cosmology had spread all the way out to Crete in the west and the Indus Valley in the east.
Because these ancient people were now totally dependent on the soil, their entire worldview shifted to center around one original focal figure, the bountiful goddess Earth. This is really where our deep-seated concept of Mother Nature begins. She governed the nourishment of life, and she was the dark receiver of the dead for rebirth. By the time of these early high civilizations, she wasn't just some local fertility spirit anymore. She'd evolved into this massive, metaphysical symbol, the absolute arch personification of space, time, and matter. Everything with a form or a name was seen as her child, held safely within her cosmic womb.
And this brilliantly illustrates the dual nature of the great goddess. Just look at how it's preserved in ancient artifacts, like these Mycenaean plaques showing two queens and a king. On one side, you have the goddess of the living, bringing forth bounty. On the other side, the dreadful queen of the underworld, the goddess of the dead.
With the child passing between her two forms, it represents this continuous, unbreakable cycle of life, death, and rebirth. It's a perfect mythological mirror of the agricultural seasons they were living through every single year.
And we see this exact same Bronze Age planting mythology echoing much later in classical Greece. Think about the famous mysteries of Eleusis. You've got Demeter, the Earth Mother, Persephone, the Queen of the Underworld, and Triptolemus, the young god of grain. The Earth goddess maintained her encompassing metaphysical role for thousands of years. For these early civilizations, submission to the Earth wasn't really a choice you made. It was just the unquestioned reality of existence. You lived, you died, and you returned to the soil.
But then an incredible, world-altering disruption happened. Toward the close of the Age of Bronze, roughly around 1250 BC, the old goddess mythologies were radically transformed and, in large measure, completely suppressed. So, who did the suppressing? Suddenly intrusive patriarchal warrior tribes. We're talking about Semitic nomads coming out of the Syro-Arabian deserts and Hellenic Aryan herders sweeping down from the plains of Europe. Now, these were nomadic herders, not settled farmers. They didn't rely on the cyclical, predictable seasons of the soil. They relied on movement, action, and the vast sky above them. Because of that, they fundamentally shifted the mythology away from an earthbound destiny and instead started championing the self-moving free will of the individual warrior, or a distinct sky-dwelling god.
So the crucial point is how Campbell impartially analyzes this shift. He shows how these new patriarchal cultures actively inverted the older planting mythology symbols to establish their new order. It was literally a mythological 180-degree turn. Take the serpent. For 7,000 years, it was revered as a lord of truth and rebirth. Suddenly, in the new myth, it gets a massive PR downgrade and becomes the ultimate deceiver. The tree of knowledge is forcefully separated from the tree of immortal life. Or look at the story of the brothers Cain and Abel. Cain the farmer, representing the older culture, is rejected, while Abel the shepherd, representing the new nomadic herders, is favored. And suddenly, our stories are filled with heroes, like Zeus or Yahweh, actively slaying the great earthbound dragons and serpents of the older goddess culture.
Now here is where Campbell issues a major warning: the danger of reading these ancient myths as literal historical facts. These biblical and Greek storytellers were using powerful poetic metaphors to explain a massive cultural shift. But when we take these metaphors literally, when we read them positivistically, it creates this violent tidal seesaw. It binds people into contending tribal groups, East versus West, pagan versus Orthodox, constantly fighting over the local masks of the divine, completely missing the deep, shared psychological realities hiding right underneath them.
So where does all this leave us? Well, after decades of research, Campbell brought this all to a grand synthesis. He concluded that human spiritual history is actually unfolding like a single magnificent symphony. All of these incredible variations, the Eastern transcendent mystery, the Western personal creator, the ancient earth goddess, and the patriarchal sky heroes, they are all ultimately complementary masks of the exact same human spiritual evolution. We are all participating in the same grand music, just playing different movements with themes announced, developed, amplified, and turned about.
Which brings us to our final thought for this explainer. If all these gods, goddesses, heroes, and dogmas are just fairies, if they are just poetic masks worn by the same ultimate reality, what happens when you realize that? When you look past the historical conflicts, past the specific cultural masks that humanity has placed over the divine for the last 10,000 years, what mystery is looking back at you? It's a profound question, and one that absolutely changes how you experience the world today. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep seeking, and I'll see you next time.